fear feeds on time. And so he says, just open the donut shop, like get into action. He also has a tool where you draw a line, and above the line is the thinking and below the line is the doing. And he said, it's oftentimes like a beach ball that you're pushing underwater. And Phil's admonition or call is to continue to hold pressure down, meaning continue to stay in action, because thinking does nothing. Action in the universe allows for you to become a partner in the grand scheme of the universe and its design.
Yeah, it makes me think of kind of action without the expectation of outcomes. And just approaching each moment with the next action. I think that's what Joseph Campbell was kind of talking about with following your bliss. Just kind of getting a little bit of sense of what that is next and all of it. Yeah, so I guess where we came from was talking about the kind of the three energies of the universe, and that each person might have a constitution that's more like one or the other. But yeah, should I dive in a little bit into those?
Yeah, so let me just frame it up. So in the context of primarily serving individuals that are impacted by a compulsive disorder of some kind. So that disorder can be something like an addiction. It can be something like drugs or alcohol. It could be a sex addiction or porn. It could be a gaming addiction. It could also manifest in some ways in terms of a compulsive disorder that leads to narcissistic personality disorder. In that context, as I've understood it from Melody Beattie's work, the result of those disorders effectively are codependency. And since we lose our sense of self in light of that disorder. And so in trying to heal and serve, what would it look like for one to find their energy again in the context of a somewhat codependent relationship? In other words, if codependency is on one side of the extreme and counterdependency, meaning you're afraid to be in contact with anybody, is on the other, interdependency in relationship with others is that center.
Yeah.
How can we find interdependency? How can we find our center? And how can we come at it from the framework that you and I were discussing?
Yeah. So I think that one finds this from getting in touch with the source behind that. And so it's kind of what I'm thinking of here is, as a young child, we actually can emit this energy, and we know it quite well. And we'll say our nervous system starts to understand that some of these aspects of ourselves aren't accepted. And so our nervous system puts little knots and kind of tensions in, says, oh, can't quite be this energy that is free flowing. I have to kind of, can't do that thing, can't do that thing. And so as one grows older, they end up having quite a few knots. And so that energy, even though it's always being emitted, starts to get filtered through knots. And then it comes out in all sorts of things. And I don't think it's unique to people in addictions. I think they might be especially sensitive to these things, and they've developed codependency or something like that throughout time, because they've learned that they're kind of fighting in a way the knots, and it's difficult if you're not actually going to the place where the knots don't exist, and spending time kind of bathing there. I think that's what self-care is trying to get at, but it's not necessarily doing it a lot of times. It's maybe doing it for a short amount of time, but it might take a little bit more than that. So in this framework, one goes into the place where the knots aren't as sticky and aren't as tight, and naturally it starts releasing the knots. And I think in that release, people can get even a little more scared, right? Oof, like this emotion or this way of being that I've pushed down for so long is feeling comfortable enough to come out again. And it's just possibly going to break something, because it often comes out in a relationship. It might break my marriage. It might break my family unit that I've thought is the thing that is holding it all together. But it might not be that way, actually. There might be something else that holds it all together. Now, does that mean that one has to break everything themselves? Not necessarily, but it's kind of like that story you were telling about the guru you trust a guru because you think they know something more than you or are wiser, or you might even feel it. You might feel that they know something. And so, in some cases, the guru's method you might not want to question. And this is similar to the way we're born in, right? With our parents. We treat our parents as the ultimate gurus in the beginning. And now, subtly, we find out that it's just they're not the ultimate gurus. They aren't necessarily, we even treat of them maybe maybe even higher than a guru, like almost like a divinity, And we realize, oh, something's broken about this. So we start to say, oh, I can't be that way. So that process of when things start coming out is that courage almost to grab the stick and keep it from hitting you from the guru, And that's like, maybe even sometimes it's like, oh, I'm going to yell at my mother, because I didn't get to do that for years and years. Now, it doesn't have to exactly work out that way, but sometimes it does. And then the one finds out sometimes on the other side that, oh, it's not breaking. Everything isn't going to hell because of my expressions. And so those knots start to leave. And then a clear understanding of that central energy starts to become, clear, I guess. Yeah. So for what I've seen is that someone who can kind of dip below or dip into the space from which all these things arise, then they can start to dip into that healing pathway in a pretty quick manner. I mean, I've been doing that kind of dipping in for maybe 4 years now, and a lot has cleared up. A lot has cleared up, and yeah.
So one tendency in those moments is there's fear and laziness, right? To use a Rudolf Steiner phrase, there's the fear to not show up and move forward. So the lack of courage in that sense, meaning not that I don't want to talk about or address the fear. It's like courage is the willingness to act in the presence of fear. So to move forward into it. Whereas perhaps laziness is not having a certain level of discipline. You know that it's important, but you lack a structural, reactive or expansive discipline that allows for you to enter into those moments and to engage in that practice. So fear or laziness ultimately is preventing us from allowing the energy to flow freely. And the way you talked about self-care, in that in many ways self-care is trying to get to those knots and release them, reminded me of how difficult it is for people in codependent relationships to value themselves to the point in which self-care is even something that they consider, like it's a step that they're even thinking about, because so much of their being is occupied on their fixation on the other person's, disorder or disease. How can we come back to that sense of interdependence? How can we come back to that sense of knowing who we are on our own unique path so that we can embody more of that energy that's coming through us. And it would be helpful to talk about the sat, the chit, and ananda in this context, I think.
Yeah. So what's coming to mind at first is radical acceptance. And a lot of things start to just move. One doesn't necessarily have to engage super tightly with their own tensions to even have that stuff start to move, especially through acceptance. One doesn't even have to really know Sat, Chit, Ananda, or know any of these energies in their mind. They don't really have to know them for them to arise, especially out of this acceptance of maybe failures, or if regrets are coming through, or there's all sorts of thoughts that keeps one from moving, right? And it does come from diving into something that is has more infinite fuel, basically. It kind of comes from a deep dive into a loving presence that gives the courage that makes these things come through. So that loving presence is Sat, Chit, Ananda. So, and then one might, after enough time, maybe, or maybe just one extremely powerful experience, they might already start to know if they have more of one of the other. They might not even know personally. Someone might have to tell them. But so Sat, if we want to get into it, Sat, Chit, Ananda.
So let me just pause for a second and interject and just ping pong this. So when we talk about, for example, in the heroic community that I've been a part of for now a couple of years, a tool called targeted thinking. The step 0 of targeted thinking is radically accepting reality. Step 2 is asking, what do I want? Step 3 is saying, now what needs to get done in order for me to do it? And then step 4 effectively is getting into action. So being able to pull back from a teleological standpoint and saying, I have a goal and I know steps I need to go about taking in order to reach that goal. But the first step in that being radical acceptance, not trying to fix or manage or control the past, not trying to blame or judge circumstances or self or others, but to own all that has happened and all ultimately that will happen, right? Before one can even ask the question, what is it that I want? So let's assume that we're at a place where we've allowed radical acceptance to drop in, which in some sense allows for the healing energy to come to us. And my question then at that point is, what do I want? I want to come to know myself because I've lost so much of my knowing at the point of interconnectedness. I want to know myself from a place of interdependency, not know myself as who I am not, versus know myself for who I am. I will never be, but who I am. How do we get there from the framework?
Softness. Being really soft and care. Even in this moment, one can just, sometimes breathing, people do really well with breathing. But noticing that, oh, hey, I've been hard around a lot of things in my life, and in a lot of ways, that's part of that tension. That one of those lessons one learns as a kid is to, well, if I want to be successful, I need to grab even tighter, grab life by the horns, tight. Now, consistency and moving, doing things consistently is important too. So maybe in a way you kind of have to grab life by the horns, but you don't necessarily have to hold tightly. Maybe you're grabbing a liquid soap, It's like, oh, it's very like you're grabbing lotion, like it's very soft. So I think it's a bit difficult to talk about it from, like a framework to think about. It's very much a returning. It's very much, I think about the first time I fell in love, and I felt very much like the best version of myself. I didn't have to do anything necessarily. Softness was there. So in a way, it's getting in touch again with the source of love, and letting that source become the healer itself. I think we've talked about getting out of the way. I know I love the Jesus take the wheel, Yeah, I mean, love take the wheel, softness take the wheel and see where it goes. And sure, I think that's the hero's journey. Is it starts not necessarily with an initiation of I'm going to do this. It's an initiation of love is here right now, and I don't always see it. Oh, okay. And then it's very much a process of bathing in that love, and then it can, the healing process can bring one out then, and then it's going back, and this can happen at periods of life, and also can happen in this moment, in every moment.
Do we share a general tendency or a disposition to engage in that energy in a particular way?
Certainly, yeah. This is where people in some paths talk about a practice that might help, some sort of practice. So I guess maybe that's in a sense what you might be asking about, like how can, it's a little nicer to have a bit of a concrete practice. So different people will enjoy different practices. I know for me, I've tried a bunch of different practices, and it ended up being an effortless mantra style meditation that I can do all the time. And eventually build kind of letting some of those movements happen. I can't make it happen with my mind. I have to actually use a practice that's already pre-built kind of pathways into that source of love. And so not every practice is also equal, because someone's constitution might enjoy a particular practice. Maybe they enjoy breath work or, yoga, like asana yoga. But in the end, a practice that helps one relax from those tendencies and allow some sort of greater power or good to start moving through those tensions. And then having that practice is important. And because when those tensions come through, it actually is even more likely that I don't want to let that go. I don't want to let that go. That's the person's psyche has convinced itself that those tensions are what keeps it safe. And actually they might have been, to be honest, in a lot of households, a lot of societal situations. So it's the key is to find that source of love again.
So just finally, I would imagine from that place of relaxation and the energy is now flowing. Can you talk about how that energy shows up in one of three ways for people?
Yeah. Well, it can definitely be a mix of this sat truth, or sat is this truth or this settledness that kind of sits deep in the body. Um, it's that sense maybe that people are going for when they go to a cozy winter cabin. And they have the fire on, they've gotten rid of all their electronics, and they're just kind of laying in this couch, feeling infinitely comfortable, but maybe even heavy, but not in a psychological heaviness way. And so that can come while you're meditating too. I know I've had times where I felt like I was going to break the bed that I was laying on. So heavy. I had a friend, I think he got so heavy that like the way he was lying down wasn't comfortable enough, and he did have a little nick in his rib. Like he was like, "Oh, what happened?" So yeah, that's why the comfortability aspect's really important of the body. And then you have shit or chit, shit. That's the clarity that comes, and it's pretty self-explanatory, I think. Yeah, it's the clarity can run from being clear about an idea or a movement in life to clarity that everything is okay right now, even with all my addictions, all my tendencies and neuroses, and all these things that are going on around me. The clarity can just be that it's all okay right now. And then you have Ananda, the bliss. Yeah, this is usually the movement energy, like like, oh, I'm gonna, like I feel sometimes that the Latinas and Latinos and Latinxes, they got that bachata. Looks like very, very good at that. Yeah. So that can, I think, that can also come too. And these things just start arising more naturally as one continually goes to the place of feeling. And it's any of these three energies you might feel more dominant in one of them, but you're going to feel all of them if you go through with it.
And is the recommendation to say, for example, if what I want after accepting radical reality is to come to know myself at a deeper level, and one way of going about getting there is to release into love and that practice. And then the question becomes, who am I? Like, what purpose do I serve? Is it recommended that someone pull the thread on that energy, so to speak, like let that particular energy go, and work through you? Or how do you know like when to answer the call when it comes to Joseph Campbell's, to use that frame? Like, is there an overwhelming sense of energy that's coming that's like, I need to answer this call? Or is it quiet and it's soft? Or
it could come differently for different people. And in some ways, maybe one isn't necessarily answering a call sometimes because they're not ready. And sometimes it's just a little bit of a kick, I suppose. Yeah. can't necessarily answer that. This is maybe why it is useful to have someone that's done the process a bit to bounce off with and talk to, and then you can get some more individualized feedback. And really the key for that practice is innocence. And so it's nice to have someone who's practiced quite a bit, because we realize how many little avenues one can go down and get maybe a little bit stuck in, per se, and they usually involve a non-effortless way of practicing that, and it can start to bleed, right? It can start to bleed into outside of the closed eye time. And when it starts to bleed in, then some of those questions about when to go and when not to go can be answered just by pure intuition. Just by following one's bliss. And maybe that's the hardest part. Oftentimes we associate bliss and healing and love with certain things that might go away. And that's probably the scary part, is to consider that something that I thought was giving me what I really wanted and the only thing I thought maybe I had left is actually going to either change or go away.
I talk about celebrating the sensitivity that is your superpower, and that there are all these kryptonites, sprinkled dust everywhere around us. And that if you can come back to center and trust your intuition and develop a certain sense of confidence, meaning confidere, extreme trust in oneself, to listen to that voice, allow for that love to drop in, that healing to take place, then the ability to answer the call, it becomes almost a moment to moment to moment experience, because it's always visiting us, and it's the abundance of the blessings that cause our neglect of the blessings themselves. There's so much there. There's so much love and healing and light that it's easy for us to forget it. So thank you for the gentle reminder. And if, say, for example, someone were to want to work with someone such as yourself to explore some of those different avenues, how could they find you?
Yeah. So I am on Facebook and Instagram as Govinda Yost on Facebook and govinda.light on Instagram. And also one can work through my website, which maybe we'll find a link to, but also it's theeffortlessway.life. So theeffortlessway.life.
And just one final question for you. If there was one thing that as a community of people we could do for you, what would that one thing be?
Go through the process of healing. Relax. Enjoy life.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.